Hi, I'm Dan Lagani with Silver Solutions, and welcome to a new episode of AgeWise. Our goal with every show is simple, and that's to make you a little smarter about something you'll need to know as you and your loved ones grow older. We sat down with our guest today a couple of weeks back and had a deep and wide-ranging conversation. She's an award-winning author and a clinical psychologist. Her name's Deborah Derrickson Kossmann. She's also the author of a wonderful book, Lost, Found, and Kept. And that really was the source of where we kicked off the conversation, and where she discovered along the way, working with her aging mother, that mom had severe hoarding tendencies. And through that battle, she was also able to successfully navigate a transition for her mom into assisted living. So if you're interested in tips from an experienced and compassionate family caregiver and a mental health professional, today's show of AgeWise is absolutely one you'll enjoy. Deb Kossmann, thanks so much for joining us today on AgeWise.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
So, Deb, let's jump right to it. Your current book, Lost, Found, Kept. Did I get that right, or did I have this? Good. I was worried that I was going to get the sequence wrong. But your current book, Lost, Found, and Kept, is the journey that you talk about as you discover that your mom has hoarding disorder. Talk to us about that discovery and really the kernel of how it inspired this book.
Yeah, the book had actually started a couple years before we discovered my mother's hoarding, and I had kind of left my mother out of the story because I had vowed I wasn't going to write about her while she was alive. And in 2016, there was a crisis, which I think happens with a lot of elderly people. She had an auto accident and totaled her car. And at that point, we knew that there were things going on in the house, and I had started discovering that there were bills that were unpaid. And typically, of folks with hoarding disorder, things go for a while in kind of a functional way, and then they start to disintegrate. And that was the case with her. She had been hospitalized a few months before the automobile accident, and there were things that were happening. So we actually got into the house, and I want to be clear that we had not been in that house for 30 years.
You know, that's an interesting comment that you hadn't been into the house for 30 years. Through part of what we do at Silver Solutions, we work with a lot of families who someone is suffering with hoarding disorder. It's a very common thing for it to be a secret, even to the family members. Was that the case with you, or did you know and it was something that you grew up with?
We knew we did not grow up with it. She had started hoarding a little bit when we were adolescents, but it really took off, which I think is very common with hoarding disorder. 55% of folks before the hoarding really takes off have suffered a loss or some kind of trauma. And I think that for my mom, part of the trauma was her mother dying, and part of it was also my sister and I separating and leaving home. And I think that was really when the hoarding took off. And so we knew that it was happening. What we didn't know was how bad it was. When we got into the house, we realized she hadn't had water in that house for between 2 and 6 years.
Let me ask you a hard question. And because I know that it exists in most people's minds, which is, how is it possible that you didn't recognize the magnitude of it? And what would you say to somebody who's sitting there thinking that about themselves? Am I a bad child that I'm not aware, that I wasn't aware, and I just discovered this with my own mom or dad?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly, the guilt and kind of dealing with it, even as a psychologist. I'm a professional. I should know how to deal with these things. The unfortunate thing is my profession doesn't do a very good job dealing with this. And I also think the other thing, Dan, and this is probably true with many of the people that you work with, is people function autonomously, even with mental illness. And so my mother was functional. She was driving around. She had friends. She had a volunteer job that she did. There were things that were happening. She was capable of making her own decisions, even if they weren't good ones. So the line comes when someone's mentally ill, particularly as they age. Where is that line between the person's autonomy and taking care of them?
The title itself, what's the significance of each of the three words?
Mm-hmm. Well, the book is divided up into, it talks about the narrative through line in the present day is the hoarding disorder and discovering it and how we cleaned out the house and what happened with my mom. Coming off of that, kind of alternating chapters is about my growing up and my relationship with my mother and trying to make sense of how do we get to this place? Like what was it about my childhood and my family and my mother's childhood that brought us here? So part of it is about what was lost. In my family, my mother was divorced twice. There's a number of things that were lost in my family. And then the finding, is about getting into the hoarding house and what we discovered, and kind of also my own identity in terms of what I found as part of that. And the keeping is about, what do you do with those relationships? How do you have compassion and empathy in a relationship with someone who struggles like this?
When you think about, again, you're incredibly accomplished as a psychologist, an award-winning author. But when you think about the other two roles, among the many I'm sure that you have, of being a caregiver to an aging parent, and a daughter, which of those was most useful, and that which of those did you struggle with most going through this process with your mom?
Definitely being a daughter. My mother was not an easy woman, and my mother was really unhappy. I will share this piece. During the clean out, she stayed with my younger sister who lived nearby, and then we moved her to an assisted living facility, which she fondly called her prison. This was all before COVID, which I think often, like if this had happened during COVID, it just would have been, I can't even think about what that would have been like. But I think the challenges of, understanding family dynamics. I work a lot with families, I work with couples, I work with, adolescents separating from their parents and trying to understand, from a psychological standpoint, this is a disorder. My mother wasn't lazy. She wasn't, doing this deliberately. But at the same time, as a daughter, it's incredibly frustrating, and you're angry and resentful. I mean, I talk about this in the book about, my frustration. Like, why can't she just do what she's supposed to do? And like, why do I have to caregive? So it's incredibly challenging. Caregiving someone with this issue is incredibly challenging.
And so, obviously, not everybody has the hoarding tendencies and challenges that this book covers with your mom. But most of us that have an aging parent, and even if we have siblings to help, at some point find ourselves injected into the role of family caregiver. There's usually very little planning and preparation. Why is that societally? What is that? What is that really about?
Well, I think nobody wants to talk about aging. Certainly, nobody in our culture wants to talk about death and dying. And we're all going to get there. We're all going to be disabled at some point. We're all going to be aging. We're all going to need more help. And our culture is a culture of independence and of like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and do it yourself. And it's unfortunate because what it means is people don't plan, they don't think about what they're going to need, they don't downsize their stuff, they don't. So a lot of people who've read my book talk about, my parent wasn't a hoarder, but they had a ton of stuff. They had 60 years of Hummel figures and,
Right.
collections of different things that they thought we'd want, and we don't want this stuff. So I think this idea of, you know, how do we have these conversations as we age with our children, with our, care folks that are going to be able to be there to help us is really important.
What always occurs to me in every one of these conversations is that it comes back to a comment you made earlier. We don't like to talk about getting older. No one likes to get older. And yet, as a country, by the end of this decade, 30% of America will be over 65 or caring for somebody that is. And for something that's such a big part of essentially the DNA and fabric of America at this point, we really haven't addressed the core issues that we're all going to have to face, either with helping an older loved one or what we're going to be facing. If you could wave the proverbial magic wand and say, having gone through the process, either from a psychology perspective or as a daughter and caregiver, what are the things that you wish everybody would understand in advance so that they could go through the process more effectively, if you will?
Yeah. Well, I wish, Dan, to your point, I wish I had known about you guys when we did it because I think that would have been tremendously helpful to do it. What I do with clients now is, and I do work with a number of elderly folks as well. And I think the other thing we don't talk about is like the caregivers of the elderly folks are also elderly and dealing with their own health problems and downsizing and changes, in their lives as well. So I think first of all, understanding that there's resources available to people, your services. We used a person to help us find the assisted living for my mom. I
Right.
had no idea about the funding. I work with Medicare and I work with Medicaid, have worked in the past with no idea about that stuff. Like, and I'm a professional, I'm doctorally trained, and it's a labyrinth of stuff, like that you need an elder care lawyer to like do paperwork for stuff, or that there are certain processes for, doing a look back financially to know what you need. Somewhere there needs to be more organized places to find all that information together, because otherwise you're doing this piecemeal and by word of mouth. It's like somebody talks to somebody else about like, hey, we used this thing for our mom and that was helpful and here's what you do. It's nuts. I mean, it's not a good system.
Yeah. And again, I contrast it with, for example, people that are about to have a child. There's so many books, the what to expect when you're expecting. Ironically, we're publishing an age-wise book, a chapter a month this year, for the very reason that you said. It's, the idea that you should have to guess, even though hundreds of and thousands of people have gone generationally through the same issues over time. We agree that sharing the collective wisdom is one of the most important gifts that you can give. What are the things that either from your own experience in going through it with your mom or as a psychologist that you'd advise that family caregivers do to take care of themselves and to put boundaries in place for themselves? What are the best tips and ideas you can recommend?
Yeah, I think, it's particularly challenging when you deal with a parent with mental health problems because sometimes the boundaries can be very difficult to establish and to deal with. And like you said, oftentimes these things happen in a crisis, so there isn't really space to think about your own self-care. And one of the things that's super important for all caregivers, I mean, my own, after we cleared out the house, I had all kinds of physical issues. Both my sister and I had a fair amount of acute stress disorder. I probably still have a little bit of some traumatic stress from experiencing that and going through the clean out. It was very, very difficult. I think it's very important to have and I talk about this a little bit in the book. I mean, I went back to see an old therapist after cleaning out the house to get some support and to figure out better how to deal with my mother and to try and work on how to be more compassionate and empathetic with her because it was very difficult during the clean out because I was so angry. I think, getting individual support, there are group support things. One of the things for the hoarding piece of it, there's interestingly on Reddit, which is a social media platform, there are two children of hoarding groups and a total of 28,000 people in both of them. The
Wow.
hoarding group itself has 66,000 people in it. And that's just on social media.
And Lost Found Kept came out when? When was it originally officially released?
Lost Found Kept won. Interestingly, the hoarding story kind of organized the book. The book won the prize, the Aurora Polaris Prize in Creative Nonfiction. It won it in September of 2023. My mother actually passed away in July of 2023 rather suddenly. So interestingly, she loved space and astronomy and all things like that. So it was kind of odd that it won a prize of this name. I sort of saw it as a little kiss from my mother in a way that she was okay with my doing this. The book came out in January of this year. And so it's available online. It's available from Trio House Press, their website. My website is lostfoundkept.com, and there's links on the site to be able to order the book.
That's great. Deb, let's end on a highlight of the things that you discovered going through your mom's house. What are the things that stand out as the things you're most thrilled that you actually found and that you will always look back and say, no matter how traumatic it was, if I didn't go through it the way that I went through it, I wouldn't have this gem in my life?
Well, there are two things. One is that there's a family picture of my grandmother and her sister who died very young. It was a family trauma, and it's a picture with a goat, and it's antique. And that picture has a lot of meaning in my family. I talk about that in my book. It was taken around the turn of the century. It's one of the only pictures of that relative. I think the other thing is, and I write about this in the book and in other places as well, is that I kept my mother in a way. you know, no matter what happened in that relationship, I was very connected to my mother. The opposite of anger is not, hatred. The opposite of, anger is love. You have a strong emotional reaction to somebody. So being able to care for my mother and have her leave that environment that she had created for herself. And actually, her last 7 years in assisted living, we found out afterwards, despite her calling it a prison, she had friends, she made a life there, and she was able to enjoy her grandchildren. And right before she died, she met her first great grandchild. So I feel like that's the other piece about the book is that even through these struggles, that's the thing I kept.
Really a wonderful story, a wonderful book. Deb Kossmann, author of the award-winning book Lost, Found, and Kept. You can find it on Amazon and all the other places that Deb referenced earlier. Deb, thanks so much for joining us today on AgeWise. If you liked this show, please share it with a friend. And if you want to make certain that you get every episode of AgeWise as they're released, you can go to silversolutions.com and make certain that you're on our list. You can also go to the Apple Podcast platform and become a subscriber there. I'm Dan Lagani, and for all of us here at Silver Solutions who work hard every day to help you and your loved ones live better longer, stay safe and be wise.